Hey guys, sorry I couldn't be here today. I made a video for you going over all the notes that I was originally going to go over with you while I was in class, but since I'm not here today, you still get all the information, just not with me physically. Now, if you have any questions while I go through the notes, please make sure you write them down. I'll be happy to go over them with you next class before we take any quizzes. You do still have a quiz next class. It's over all the notes that I'm going to give you today, okay? So, as I give you the notes today during this video, I want you to try to write down as many of the notes as possible. And if I go a little too quickly, just know that at the end of the class there will be time for you to grab a laptop and fill in any blanks that you may still have in your packet of notes.
First, let's just start off with some bone facts. Bone is one of the hardest, strongest, but it's actually really lightweight material because it is hollow. Calcium is the mineral that actually makes the bones hard, but they also have a little bit of flexibility. I mean, bones can actually bend and give a little bit because they are also full of collagen fibers. Let's see, the smallest bone is located in the middle of your ear, and the largest bone is your femur. And about 20% of your body weight is from the weight of your bones. You should know by now that there's 206 bones in your body, 8 of them in the axial skeleton, and the rest are in the appendicular. Okay, so this is something from your reading guide, but just as a review, there's 4 parts of the skeletal system: your joints, cartilage, ligaments, and then of course the bones. Some of the functions of the skeletal system is to give your body support, to make you stand up straight. I think we all understand that. But they also protect your organs. Your ribs protect your lungs, your skull protects your brains. Your brain. The skeleton bones also help you move. Although, you know, obviously your muscles are what gives your body movement, the joints are where you're able to produce that movement. Blood also helps form, bones also help form blood. The fancy word for blood formation is hematopoiesis. That's a mouthful, but hemato means blood and poiesis means the formation of. So inside your bone, you've got bone marrow, and that's where blood cells are made. And then also your bones store minerals and fats. Calcium, phosphorus, and bone marrow, there's fat. All these are stored within your bones and can be released when the body needs them. Again, the minerals stored by your bones is calcium and phosphorus. And if you guys recall back to the Unit 4 when we talked about how a muscle contracts, calcium played a huge role in that muscle contraction. If you remember, calcium bind to troponin, move tropomyosin out of the way. Calcium, we'll soon learn, plays a huge role in a neuron sending an action potential as well. So calcium is very, very important, and it's stored mainly in our skeletal system. Again, just a review, there's 2 main parts of our skeletal system: the axial skeleton, that's the bones of your head, ribs, and vertebra. Then there's the appendicular skeleton. Okay. Now, there are some differences between men and women's skeletons. Men tend to have larger, heavier, more dense skeletal bones. You really can tell by the pelvic girdle. If you look at the pelvic girdle of men, they tend to be much more defined and have grooves much deeper, whereas women tend to be wider, less defined, lighter, smaller. Okay, and then the opening in the pelvic girdle is much wider on women, you know, obviously to have babies, whereas men, they tend to be more narrow. Let's see if you can figure out if this is which one's the men, which one's the female. All right, so hopefully you are saying this one's female and then this one's male, and you can tell because the one that I've labeled female is much wider. And if you look at some of the bone markings, it's just not as defined. Okay, so a few new words for you is osteoblast and osteoclast. Both of these are osteocytes, okay? An osteocyte is a broad general term for a bone cell, okay? There's two types of bone cells. There's osteoblast an osteoclast. Osteoblasts form cells. Okay, when more bone tissue is being made, the osteoblasts are at work and they're making new bone cells and bone tissue. Osteoclasts break down bone. Well, why would bone ever need to be broken down? Well, let's say you didn't drink enough milk for a while and your body's really low on calcium. Well, we got to release that calcium, and so a hormone, PTH, is released, and that hormone tells your bones to release some of that calcium, and the way it releases calcium is that the osteoclasts start to destroy the cells to release the calcium and the phosphorus into the bloodstream. Okay, so the way I remember, osteoblast builds, osteoclast kills. Okay, osteoblast builds up the bone, where osteoclasts break down the bone. Okay. There's two types of bone tissue, and I made you guys look at the two types of bone tissue when we dissected the cats. There's compact bone. This is more dense, homogenized, meaning it's just like kind of, it looks the same throughout the whole tissue. And when you look at compact bone under the microscope, it has several parts to it. Okay, so what we're looking at here is this is the compact bone. This is what we're looking at. Up here at the top, this is spongy bone. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so when you look at compact bone under the microscope, you see some pieces, parts. Okay, first you have the lacunae. Okay, lacunae are cavities, they're holes in which the bone cells, osteoblasts, osteoclasts, the osteocytes are located. Okay, then you have lamella. The thing is that these lacunae, these little cavities that I'm highlighting, they actually form in rings, okay? And one ring is called a lamella, okay? And then you have canaliculi. Isn't that a fun word to say? Canaliculi. Okay, canaliculi are these little canals, these little tubes that kind of connect all of these lamellas and lacunae. And help transport materials between the cells. One set of rings is called an osteon, which I'm going to show you in a picture on the next slide. Okay, and you have some larger canals, larger tubes that connect all these osteons. The ones that run parallel to the bone are called haversian or central canals. And then there's some that run perpendicular to the bone that we call vulcum or perforating or transverse. Really, I've heard them all interchangeably used, so I would be familiar with all the terminologies. Okay, so let me show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so if you recall back to Unit 2, when we looked at bone under the microscope, this is what we saw. And what we're looking at is this is bone tissue. Each one of these black dots is a lacuna. Right, this is where the osteocytes are located. But check it out. They actually form in little rings. Do you see that? Do you see how these lacunae form rings? One ring is called a lamella. Okay, see, one ring is a lamella. Okay, and a set of rings, if you can tell, like here's a set of rings, here's a set of rings. Oh, you know, they're all over. Here's another set of rings. Here's one set of rings. Okay, all of those rings together is called an osteon. An osteon is a set of rings, and I've got one highlighted over here, except for it's just kind of hard to see. Okay, in the middle of an osteon is one large canal. It's called the central canal or the haversian canal. And then sometimes, I'll show you on the next slide, here's a better picture, it's a drawing. Okay, so again, each one of these dots is a lacuna. I can't do it with the smartboard, and they form concentric rings. Each ring is called a lamella. Okay, a set of rings, this whole thing is an osteon. Okay, so there's an osteon, here's an osteon, there's an osteon, here's an osteon. Okay, so a set of rings is an osteon. One ring is a lamella. In the middle of an osteon, you have a central or haversian canal in which blood vessels, neurons, and other supplies go through it. Sometimes these canals go perpendicular to the bone, therefore they're called a transverse or perforating or Volcom canal. Again, I've heard them all. Okay. Then there's spongy bone. Okay, spongy bone is what's at the ends of the bone. If you look at it under the microscope, it looks very, very similar to compact bone. But when you look at it just with your, without a microscope, it's broken apart. It's lighter. It looks like a sponge, right? So back to this picture again. This is compact bone. And this is spongy bone. You can definitely tell the difference. Now, again, if we were looking at this under the microscope, they really don't have much differences. The spongy bone still has the lamella and the osteons and all the Volcom canals and things, but it's just more spread apart, more pockets of air. Okay, so here's a drawing down here, what I'm highlighting, of maybe one piece of that spongy bone. Okay, so let's talk about two more definitions, diaphysis and epiphysis. Okay, so diaphysis is the long shaft, the middle part of the bone, whereas the epiphysis is the ball. Okay. So again, the diaphysis is the long shaft. It's mostly made up of compact bone. Okay, now there is a membrane that wraps the diaphysis. It's called the periosteum. Peri means around, osteo means bone. So the membrane that goes around bone, periosteum, is it's just basically a connective tissue that wraps the whole outside of the bone. There are some blood vessels, nerve endings, and that's where the bone cells are also located. Next to the periosteum is these little fibers called Sharpie fibers. They're actually what hold the periosteum on to the bone. Okay. Inside the diaphysis is a hole, is an opening, it's hollow. It's called the medullary cavity. Inside the medullary cavity is yellow marrow. Yellow marrow is mainly just fat, and then it's just basically almost like a filler to keep the bone light. Okay. Inside the medullary cavity, so if you can just imagine, I'll show you a picture, but if you can imagine, here's your compact bone, inside is yellow marrow. Inside this medullary cavity is another membrane. This membrane is called the endosteum, okay? The endosteum separates the diaphysis, the bone, from the hollow part in the middle. Okay, so again, there's those Sharpie fibers. They're holding on this periosteum, the membrane on the outside of the bone. Then inside the bone, you've got a whole bunch of fat yellow marrow here, and there's another membrane that lines the inside of the bone called the endosteum. Endo means inside, so it kind of makes sense it's called endosteum. Okay, again, the ends of the bone are called the epiphysis. Everybody knows like the dog bone shape, right? None of our bones actually look like this. It's funny that we draw that, but this would be the epiphysis, right? Epiphysis. This is made up of mainly spongy bone. Okay, got a little bit of compact bone in there, but mainly spongy bone. And then remember, the ends of our long bones are lined with what we call articular cartilage, which is actually hyaline cartilage. If you remember looking at the cats when we dissected them, there was like a nice smooth layer on the ends of those bones, and that was that hyaline cartilage. And also they have their own marrow. It's called red marrow, and that's where blood is being made. So blood is being formed, that fancy word, hematopoiesis, in the spongy bone, in the ends of the bone, in the epiphyseal part of the bone. Okay, so again, you got the diaphysis, got the epiphysis, right? In between the diaphysis and the epiphysis is this plate, is this line. It's called the epiphyseal line. Okay, I've got a bone to show you as an example. And this epiphyseal line is where bones get longer. This is where the bone gets its length. This is where bones get longer. It's right there at that epiphyseal line. So check this out. This is an X-ray. You can see the epiphyseal line right there. Okay, epiphyseal line right there. Okay, this one's a little bit harder to see, but it is right there. Okay. Okay, so how does bone grow? What's up with bone when it's actually growing? It's called bone remodeling, and that's basically something that our bones are always doing. Our bone is always building new bone cells and breaking bone cells down. You want to hope that the amount of bone cells that are being built equals the amount of bone cells that are being broken down, right? In a healthy adult, the amount of bone that's being made should equal the amount that's being removed, okay? We basically make new bone tissue. About 10% of our bone is made every year. Okay, and this remodeling, this remaking, this breaking down and making new happens on the outside and the inside, at the periosteum membrane and at the endosteum membrane. Okay, so remember, those are the membranes that surround the outside of the bone and the inside of the bone. And these are where those osteoblasts and osteoclasts are found that are actually doing the bone remodeling. Okay, there are two mechanisms that tell our bones to break down or build up, okay? The first one is the hormonal mechanism. I kind of alluded to this earlier, but let me talk about it a little bit more in detail. Okay, let's say you forgot to drink calcium for a month or two. It could be triggered by multiple reasonings, but let's just say your body does not have enough calcium. Okay, the blood needs calcium. So what happens? Our brain goes, hey, we need calcium. So they release a hormone called the parathyroid hormone, PTH. Okay, PTH is released by a gland called parathyroid, but we'll get to that later in the endocrine unit. But basically, there's not enough calcium in the blood, so parathyroid hormone is released, and it tells those osteoclasts to break down bone. When the osteoclasts kill, right? When they break down bone, more calcium is released, brings the blood levels back up, and everything's happy, right? But let's say that there's too much calcium. Let's say mom bought 6 gallons of milk, you drank all 6 gallons of milk, and you got too much calcium in your blood. What happens? Well, your brain goes, hey, there's way too much calcium in our blood. Let's release another hormone, calcitonin. Calcitonin is another hormone, and this one specifically tells the bones to make new bone. Take all that extra calcium and store it. Keep it, build more bone cells. Okay, so we have two hormones that help when blood levels of calcium are too low and when blood levels are too high, and the whole goal is to either release or store the calcium in the bones to maintain homeostasis. Okay, then there's another mechanism called the mechanical mechanism. And that's when muscles are being pulled that's when bones are being pulled by muscles, and this causes what we call an appositional growth, okay? It actually makes the bones wider. People that have more muscle, more strength, people that are larger tend to have wider, larger bones because the bones need to support all that work that's being pulled on the bones by the muscles, and so the bones literally become wider. It's called appositional growth, where the bones become wider. Now, they don't necessarily get more bone mass. There's not necessarily more bones. So they don't really necessarily get thicker. They just get wider. So here's an example of the appositional growth, where like if this was normal, here's like when there's been lots of weight, lots of strength, lots of pulling on that bone. Okay, when we are an itty-bitty baby, a fetus, when we're in mama's tummy, look at this x-ray. Isn't this awesome? You can see how there's a little bit of bone formation going on here, but you can see, like, look at her little wrists or the pelvis, it's just still all so much cartilage. You can see right through it. It's kind of crazy that most of the cartilage, most of the skeleton when you are an itty bitty baby is hyaline cartilage, and when you're born, you still have a chunk of that hyaline cartilage in the skull, and later on it will become bone. As you grow, especially in those first 3 years, well, your bones go through this process of called ossification. Ossification is when bone is being made. Basically what happens is that hyaline cartilage gets covered up by those osteoblasts, those cells that build, and they enclose the hyaline cartilage with like a capsule of bone, and then all of a sudden the cartilage gets digested, eaten away, which forms like the hollowness of bones. And what you've got left is a solid bone with a hollow medullary cavity in the middle where bone marrow is being made. Okay, as you grow, you still have a piece of cartilage in your bone, that epiphyseal line. Remember me talking about, you know, here's the dog bone, you know, which none of our bones look like this. I know I can't draw, but we have this line here that divides the diaphysis and the epiphysis. While you're growing, when you're a kid, this line is actually made up of cartilage. And that's where the bone becomes longer as you grow. The bone lengthens at this epiphyseal line because this is still cartilage, and that cartilage allows the bone to continue to grow at that part. Okay, when you're growing, of course, more bone is being made than lost. And also, you as you are going through the ages 3 and 18, you have a division between the yellow marrow and the red marrow. Okay, when you were an itty bitty baby, everything was red marrow. But once you hit about age 3, 4 years old, that epiphyseal line makes a division, and then you have yellow marrow in the diaphysis and red marrow in the epiphysis. Okay. When you're done growing, once you're an adult, most of you guys are adults, most of you guys are 18, that epiphyseal line becomes an epiphyseal plate. Basically, that cartilage becomes a plate. You're done growing. The bones don't need to lengthen anymore. Everything hardens. And you should be making the same amount of bones that are created should equal the amount that are being broken down, so the amount of bone stays the same.
Check out this bone, you guys. This bone has a great example of an epiphyseal line. It's at the front of the classroom, so just make sure you check it out and look at it. You can see that this is a cow's bone, and it's done growing, and I know this because that line is made up of bone, and it's no longer cartilage. When it's growing, this would be cartilage, and the bone would get longer and longer and longer here. But since this is definitely bone, you can tell that this cow is done growing. And in this line, it separates the epiphysis from the diaphysis, okay? I like this bone. This bone gives you a great example of that epiphyseal line. You can really see it in this bone. So it's at the front of the classroom. Make sure you check it out. Pretty awesome.
The same? Okay, I really kind of like this image. You know, here's an x-ray of a newborn, but then here's one at 1 year old. So you start to see the formation of the carpals, but not quite all of them. By 13 years old, you see all the carpals, but you see a lot of cartilage on the ends. And then by the time you're an adult, the cartilage has, you know, disappeared, and you're done growing, and the length of your fingers and your bones have stopped. Once you hit a point, you know, who knows, everybody's different, but when you become older, there's a point where our body starts to break down more bone than being built up, okay? That's just a natural aging process. More bone matter starts to be destroyed. Okay, so here's a picture of a healthy epiphysis, healthy spongy bone, and then here you can see the gaps, the holes. This person's got a little bit of osteoporosis, a little bit of breakdown of the spongy bone.
So next class, you guys, quiz over everything I've talked about today. 10 questions, multiple choice. If you have any questions, you know I'm going to be happy to answer them. We'll do a bell ringer. There is a small chunk of notes still left to do. We'll do those next time together, and we'll work on the review.